everyone, and welcome into the ConTinual author interview programming. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. My guest tonight is John Land, the USA Today best-selling author of over 50 books, including the critically acclaimed Texas Ranger Caitlin Strong series. The most recent one, Strong from the Heart, won the 2020 American Fiction Award for Best Thriller. He has also written 6 books in the Murder, She Wrote series of mysteries and has more recently taken over Margaret Truman's Capital Crime series, the first of which, Murder on the Metro, will be published in February. A graduate of Brown University, he received the 2019 Rhode Island Authors Legacy Award for his lifetime of literary achievements. Welcome, John.
Well, can I meet that person? I'd like to get to know him because that person's a lot more accomplished than I am.
Well, look in the mirror. That should do it.
I'm looking at myself now on Zoom. It's like it's kind of like if I was an actor, I'd never go to one of my movies. You know, I can see why Johnny Depp always says how much he hates looking at himself.
Well, then let's just talk and kind of forget the camera for a while.
I'm going to mute my face.
If you figure out how to do that, we could all probably benefit from knowing that.
There you go.
But let's start with a little bit of background. What drew you to writing?
You know, it's interesting because it wasn't a lifelong dream. I never have taken a writing class in my life. I was going to go to law school. Law school was as sure a thing after college as college was after high school. But when I got to Brown, I took some literature classes my freshman year, and I fell in love with the whole. I'd always liked to read, but I fell in love with reading, taking these literature class, these English and American lit classes, which ultimately became my major. But more important than that, I fell in love with the process of writing, the idea of just putting paragraphs together, of stringing sentences, of the feeling of completion, the feeling that you get of self-actualization when you nail a perfect sentence. Now, I'm talking term papers here. I'm talking essays, but the process is the process. And I found I really enjoyed it to the point where I said, you know what? I'd like to try publishing. I'd like to try to write a magazine article and see if it can get published. And that experience led me to realize the most important thing about being a writer. I love seeing my name in print. As much as I don't want to see my face, I love seeing my name to the point where I've done 50 some odd books. I think it's 52 or 53. I've got 3 coming out in the next 6 months. So I lose track, but there's one thing I can tell you. There is a moment when the first books arrive on the doorstep, box or an envelope, depending on who sends the first copies. And this is about a month before the books are actually in stores. And every time I open up that box or that envelope and I see that finished book for the first time, I get the same excitement, the same kid-like feeling that I had the first time. The first time I published a book, the day before that the finished copies were going to arrive, I couldn't even sleep that night. I was so excited. Now, I do sleep the night before books are going to arrive now, but there's nothing I like better than opening that box. And I think if that ever wears off, then I know I'm in trouble as a writer because I've lost that magic feeling of completion, of seeing what I've done. So it's a lot of things, but the last thing is the fact that I've always been a storyteller. From the time I was a camp counselor for 25 years at Camp Samoset in Maine, what I tell people about the mark of a great thriller is that it feels it was written just for you. When you're reading that book, it feels like the writer was only thinking about you. And that's what you do when you tell a story at a campfire. When you're meeting this little kid's eyes and they're like terrified or they're hanging on your every word. I try to replicate that experience in my writing for adults that I tried to provide for kids around a campfire telling stories. And my experience telling stories, old Twilight Zones, old Alfred Hitchcock's, Stephen King books, short stories. That predates anything I'd ever written. And I started when I was 16 years old. I didn't start writing until I was about 20 in college. And I didn't start writing fiction until I was a senior in college at almost 22. So it was a process. But as Stephen King says, you scratch where it itches. Writing is the one profession you don't choose. It chooses you.
Well, let's go back to that first book that you couldn't sleep before it arrived for a minute. What book was that?
It was called The Doomsday Spiral. It was rejected by pretty much every publisher twice. And then a company called Zebra, which is now Kensington. They've gotten much bigger. They gave me a shot. And I will love that company, even though I did 3 books with them and then moved on. And I'm still friendly with the people there. The son of the original owner, Walter Zacharias, who bought my book, Stephen Zacharias, his son, now runs the company. I'd love to go back there and do another project with them. It was a mass market paperback. It cost $2.99. And it set the tone because my first 13 books were published in mass market paperback only. Because there was a time where that's how you built authors. You built them in paperback because you could put those paperbacks in the front of Walden Books and malls, and you could put them in train stations and airports. It was a different time. And if you had flashy covers and you had a great story, and the right tagline at the top, people would pick it up and they'd take it with them on a trip, or they'd take it home and they'd read it, or they'd take it to the beach. So I was very lucky that I started my career, 1983, in what was in many ways the heyday of the mass market paperback. What we think now of, if you remember the original digital explosion, when Kindle arrived, and everybody was talking, oh my God, and people couldn't buy enough of these books. It's what's going on with audio today. That's the way it was for mass market. And when you think about some of many of the most popular authors of all time, take John D. MacDonald, for example. Although he was published in hardcover, he was primarily a mass market writer. And that's one of the reasons why all his books have colors in the titles. Because in those days, when you're publishing in mass market, people are buying on impulse, just like they do today, but even more so because there were more to choose from. So the idea of branding a series with colors, or in the case of Sue Grafton, with letters, immediately created recognition of a brand. So when you saw C is for, you knew it was Sue Grafton. When you saw a color in the title, you knew it was John D. MacDonald. Your eyes knew it was John D. MacDonald. So it was a great time to be a writer, a great time to break in as a writer, I should say, because there was a means of delivery that has kind of gone away. And I count myself very fortunate that it was there when I got my start.
We know when I see strong in a title, I think it's a John Land, Caitlin Strong thriller.
And the interesting thing there is the first book of the series was called Strong Enough to Die. My original concept was each of the books was going to be strong enough to blank, strong enough to die, strong enough to bleed, strong enough to live, strong enough, and the head of the publisher of Forge, Linda Quinton, who's a dear friend of mine, and she's the daughter of Tom Doherty, who founded Tor Forge, the CEO now. And Linda said, you can't do that because Barnes and Noble and other bookstores inventory books by the first 11 letters. So if the first 11 letters are the same, that nobody's going to know what book they're supposed to be ordering. So that's where we came up with the concept of the first word would always be strong. And then it would follow from there. The problem is after 11 of these, I'm running out of things that could be strong. But every time I say that, something else occurs to me. So stay tuned.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Caitlin for a few minutes. For readers who are not familiar with Caitlin Strong, could you tell us who she is and kind of what the series is about?
The series is about a female Texas Ranger, which is what Caitlin is. So she is a female thriving in a male-dominated world of law enforcement in the macro, but the Texas Rangers in the micro. And she is a fifth-generation Ranger. Her great-grandfather, her great-great-grandfather, her great-grandfather, her grandfather, and her father were all Texas Rangers, which explains why she's accepted into the ranks, even though she's a woman, because it's not an easy world to succeed in for a woman. So right away, she's a norm buster. She doesn't accept stereotypes. So in that sense, I created her in 2008. The first book was published in 2009. In that sense, I think Caitlin was way ahead of her time. I think she was a woman who was striking out on her own, an independent woman who was not letting someone else define her. She was defining herself on her own terms. She is a relentless crusader for justice, which is the tradition of the Texas Rangers. And in essence, Nancy, she is a gunfighter. She has a mentality of a gunfighter. Even though she's a woman, she doesn't back down. You know, she is going to stand up for what's right. And what you see as the series unfolds, as it evolves, is as she becomes surrogate mother for these two teenage boys who grow older as the series goes on, her maternal instincts surface. And you have, in answer to your question, this constant tugging on her character between the maternal instincts of a more traditional woman and the gunfighter mentality of the Texas Ranger, who's most at home when she's on her own and when she's fighting for, as I said, justice.
Well, now her boss, Captain Tepper.
Love him.
I love him too, but he calls her Hurricane Caitlin.
Hurricane Caitlin.
Where'd that come from?
Well, I got to tell you, I don't know. I'd like to say, oh yeah, sure, I thought of it, but I don't think things for my characters. They speak them, and I just listen. And I think the fact is that Caitlin makes a mess wherever she goes. In pursuit of what she's going to get, nothing is going to stand in her way. She's going to knock it over. She's going to bulldoze it. She's going to blow it away, just like a hurricane would. So, and now, you know, he calls her a category 10. Hurricane Caitlin is at it again. And it's kind of a running joke between them. You see, here's an important distinction. When you get hooked on a series, it's not just the hero that you're hooked on. It's much easier for a series to be successful if there are recurring characters the way there are on television that you get used to and you look forward to seeing again. And I'm amazed. Now, no one's ever listed Captain Tepper as their favorite character, but any number of people have listed Leroy Epps as their favorite character. And Leroy might even, he's either a figment of the male lead, Court Wesley Masters' imagination. Court Wesley is a Texas outlaw, a killer that Caitlin once put in jail. And now they're kind of romantically involved. And it's his two boys that Caitlin is kind of raising with him. So Court Wesley, you know, is a different kind of you know, you see him, but Leroy Epps is a ghost that he ruined, you know, is his friend from prison who died in prison and now shows up whenever he needs some advice, and who has this weird obsession with root beer. You know, is he there? Is he not? That's one of the questions. A lot of people love Guillermo Paz, the 7-foot Venezuelan assassin, the deadliest man in the world, who's hired to kill Caitlin in the first book. And by the way, he was supposed to die in the first book. But I fell in love with his character so much, I couldn't kill him. And this is the thing. I said before, a great thriller should feel like it was written just for you. Well, the other thing any thriller, great or otherwise, but if you want to write a great thriller, have fun telling the story. Have fun with it. Because if you have fun, I have fun writing my books. So I know you're going to have fun reading them. How do you think a reader is going to enjoy your books if you hate it? I mean, I get such a kick out of writers who say, I hate my new book. Well, I'm not going to like it then. I already know that. So why am I going to read it if you don't even like it? So I'm my own biggest fan. And part of the reason for that is you have these recurring characters who I never know what they're going to say. I kind of know what they're going to do, but not always. and I let them be themselves. They're so real to me. They come to life. That's why I love writing dialogue so much. And when I describe a scene, I don't describe it from the outside looking in. I describe it from the inside looking out through the viewpoint of a character. So the audience, the reader, sees what the character sees, not what the narrator sees. There's never a portion of my Caitlin Strong books where the omniscient narrator comes in and tells you what you're supposed to see. No, that's like voiceover in a movie. You don't need it. Let the characters tell the story.
We know Guillermo Paz has a very unusual story. Aside from starting out as an assassin, he's a very layered character. And given that you intended for him to die in the first book, did he start out with all those layers, or did those just evolve?
No, that's the fascinating thing about this. Let me tell you, Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, said, "Good writers borrow, great writers steal." When I was in the midst of writing or planning Strong Enough to Die, I went and saw the movie No Country for Old Men. And I went by myself. I had to see this movie because I knew it was going to be the tone and texture of the story was going to be a lot like what I wanted to do. And No Country for Old Men features one of the great villains of all time, played by the Academy Award winner, Javier Bardem, a killer, a force of nature named Anton Chigurh. And both the book and the movie on which it's based, No Country for Old Men, has a scene where Anton Chigurh just walks into a gas station to pay for gas, 65 cents for a gallon. And he's buying a candy bar. And for the next 5 minutes, he proceeds to psychologically torture this poor simpleton behind the counter. That scene terrified me. And it made me realize how much you could do with a scene with regards of pacing, suspense, edge of your seat tension without anything else happening. So I had this vision that Guillermo Paz would be my version of Anton Chigurh. But Guillermo Paz had other ideas. And when I introduced him, all of a sudden there was a scene where he was going to a priest. I had this vague notion. He's not going to confess what he's going to do and what he's done. He's going to confess in advance to get permission for what he has to do. He figures he wants God's blessing for killing a whole lot of people. And in the midst of this scene, I realized Paz didn't want to be the way he was. He was in search of something, but he couldn't understand. He didn't know what it was yet. Spiritual enlightenment, I guess is what you'd say. So now Paz, who in flashbacks we learned witnessed the murder of the priest who saved his own, who counseled him and made him feel he was worth something as a little boy. And years later, Paz killed, at the age of 15, he killed his first man. Might have even been 14. He killed the man who killed his priest. At that point, you have a character who is capable of redemption and therefore is not a character that I could kill off. He was just too rich. Now, I will say, based, what I just said about No Country for Old Men, I've written one chapter, one scene in my career that I can't read again. I can't read it. Stephen King talked about doing this with Pet Sematary. Many people say it's the scariest book he ever wrote. He scared himself so much he put it aside. He put half of it in a drawer and he didn't go back to it for many years later when he was ready. George R.R. Martin talks about in Game of Thrones, I forgot which book it was, the book that has the red wedding. He got to the red wedding scene, the famous red wedding scene many of us remember from the TV show. He got to the red wedding scene and he skipped it. He skipped writing it because he knew if he wrote that scene in sequence, he would not be able to write the rest of the book. So chapter 41 of my book, Strong Vengeance, introduces a pedophile as a villain. Nothing happens in the scene. It's just dialogue. But it scared me so much. I once read it out loud when someone said they wanted me to read something that I thought was typified the kind of style I had. So I read that out loud, and halfway through I was shaking. I can never read chapter 41 of Strong Vengeance again. because I felt it so much. And I didn't write that dialogue. This character spoke that dialogue. But let me tell you, when I dump him into a giant trash compactor in the end with a forklift, that killing I enjoyed. I couldn't kill Paz and never will, but I enjoyed killing the pedophile Jalbert Toms.
Well, speaking of characters that recur and don't, you've done something that not all series writers do, which is that you've progressed these people through their lives. They're not frozen in time. Court Wesley's sons mature and their lives change. Caitlin has acquired a sister she maybe doesn't exactly want.
I love that character. Another great character.
Could you tell everybody a little about those particular family supporting characters?
And we're talking about, that's a great point. It's such a great point. Let me start with the second part, with Nola Delgado, Caitlin's half-sister. I introduced Nola Delgado in book 10, and she has a major role in book 11. I had a notion what I was doing, but I didn't know it was going to come out as good as it did. But series at around that 10th book mark tend to get stale. They tend to get tired. So the way you refresh them, the way you keep your readers feeling that they're reading, that every book they read is like the first one, is by introducing new characters. So that's the purpose of Nola Delgado. The boys are in every book, at least mentioned in every book, and usually one of them has a subplot. Dylan was 14 in the first book, and Luke was 10. Luke is now 18 and Dylan is 22. Even though 10 years or 11 years have passed, I have truncated it just a little bit. I will say, as an aside, Robert Parker said the biggest mistake he ever made in his writing career was making Spencer a Korean War veteran, because you're dating him. And now people who know the series know his age. Now, James Lee Burke created Dave Robichaux as a Vietnam vet and is not shy in the books of admitting that Dave Robichaux is in his 70s now. He's still kicking butt with Clete Purcell, but he's in his 70s. That's a little hard to sell. The great thing about what you're referring to with the kids, because they are our barometer for the passage of time, is how they grow into the plots, they're not just window dressing. Examples. Nola Delgado, Caitlin's half-sister, gets to her by seducing Dylan, who is not 14 anymore. He's 22 or 21. So let's get that out there, that he's 21 when he gets seduced by Nola Delgado. And he's introduced in Strong as Steel. She's introduced, and their relationship is introduced as Strong as Steel. But I don't throw it away. In Strong from the Heart, they're living together in Providence, Rhode Island. And you get the feeling that it's not about Caitlin anymore. It's about the fact that these two kids really like each other. They like each other's company. And Dylan is used to being around killers, so being around Nola Delgado doesn't bother him. In Strong from the Heart, the most recent book, which came out over the summer, which feels like a million years ago these days, the book opens with Luke, who's now 18, overdosing and almost dying on snorting Oxycontin, which gets us into the plot, which is about the opioid crisis and Caitlin uncovering the real power behind it. This is important because John D. MacDonald, who I mentioned before, was once asked by a young writer. Young writers would knock on his door in Longboat Key, literally the same place where Travis McGee lived on the Busted Flush, a boat Travis McGee won a card game as his protagonist. And McGee would write in the morning. McDonald would write in the morning, and he would drink a lot of the afternoon sitting on his desk. And a lot of days, young writers just showed up and they'd have a gin and tonic or a vodka tonic or whatever he was drinking that day. And one day a writer asked him, Mr. McDonald, you're always telling writers, write a great story, but you never say what a great story is. John D. MacDonald looked at him and said, stuff happens to people you care about. almost any writer can write a lot of stuff. But what separates the good writers from the writers you look forward to reading time and time again is the people that you care about. There is an emotional, in all the Caitlin Strong books, there's a structural core where something terrible is going to happen unless Caitlin can stop it. That's the form of the thriller. You know, you've got action scenes galore, you've got gunfights, and you've got some big plot. You don't know how. A lot of people are going to die. The world's going to change, but you don't know how. You got to keep reading to find out. Then you have an emotional core of what is happening in the characters' lives that make us care about them. Now, some would say it's separate from the structural core. I say no, because at some point in every Caitlin Strong book, all my books, the emotional core and the structural core intersect, they collide. And you realize a lot of what is happening in the structural core is the characters working out the problems or dealing with the results of something that happened, you know, emotionally. So it's important, vital, crucial. If you don't make me, if I'm a reader, if I don't care about the characters, I'm not going to like the book, even if you're the best action writer in the world. On the other hand, you could create the most interesting, fascinating, wonderful, colorful characters, but if nothing happens to them, I'm going to be bored out of my mind. The key is to do both. The key is to follow the McDonald rule, John D. McDonald. Stuff happens to people the reader cares about.
Well, you know, when I read Strong Enough to Die, I didn't expect to care about Court Wesley, but I ended up by the middle of the book really seriously in his corner, and he's a very complex character. So could you talk a little bit about how he is structured?
Well, it's such a beautiful introduction because he's getting out of prison when you first meet him. Caitlin has put him in prison, and his intention when he gets out of jail is to kill her, is to get his revenge because he's innocent. He believes she framed him. In fact, somebody else did. But that's not what he thinks. He thinks she framed him and he wants revenge because he doesn't care if he goes back to prison. But then, now he's got these two sons. He's never met them. You know, he went to prison, but even before that, his girlfriend did not want him in their lives because he was a killer. He was an enforcer for the mob, former special forces guy, you know, special Green Beret in the army who fought in the Persian Gulf War. And he did some really bad things over there, ultimately got him thrown out of the army. And then he became an enforcer for the mob. So he's complex in that sense, but there's a moment, and books like life are defined by moments. And the moment when Court Wesley, and he's got this picture of his boys, it's the only thing he has of them in prison, of them just about that age, maybe a few years younger. And he looks at the picture and he sees them and he realizes they're older now. And they're in the front yard skateboarding. He's just parked down the block. And he's so angry that he's not a part of their lives. But if he kills Caitlin, he'll never be a part of their lives. So the great moments in fiction, not just thrillers, but any fiction, is when a character makes a decision that is different than when they started out. They choose a different path for themselves. This is where a lot of thrillers go wrong, because basically at the beginning of the book, you meet the characters and they are following their paths and nobody ever deviates from their path. Think about, let me give you an example that I didn't write. The classic movie, The 3 Days of the Condor, and the book, 6 Days of the Condor. The movie is a better example because the scene I'm about to quote is not in the book. We meet the Max von Sydow character in 3 Days of the Condor, whose name is Joubert. He's the world's foremost assassin. He's a cold-blooded killer. He's got some redeeming qualities, but the first time we meet him, he's killing a woman, something, especially in 1972, was taboo. We're not supposed to like him, but by the end of the movie, we do, because he's a fully rounded character. He comes to life because he comes to understand the hero, and he comes to help the hero. And he doesn't kill the hero when he has the opportunity to. He saves the hero instead. It's a brilliant moment. It's a brilliant scene. And we see someone do something that we weren't expecting them to do. We get surprised by a character, not just by a twist in the tale, but by a character's behavior. I love winding up my characters like dolls and just seeing where they go. You know, it's kind of like when you're a little kid and you've got one of those cars that's battery operated, and you turn it on and you let it go, and you wait to see where it's going to crash into. And sometimes, it's going left, it's going right. Those things were, when I was growing up a million years ago, they never worked right. They were always going backwards when they're supposed to go forwards, and they would always crash. They'd always fall apart. They lasted about a day before they broke. Well, that's the randomness of life. And it should also pervade fiction. I was auditioning to be someone's written with author. And the reason I was auditioning is because the money was unbelievable. I was chasing the bucks. I'm admitting it, right? I couldn't not chase them. But this other writer, who shall go nameless, hated my work. Hated me. I mean, literally, he had all these other co-writers. They weren't independently as successful as I was at the time, and they weren't as well reviewed. They hadn't won awards. And at one point, finally, one of his co-writers said, "You know why he hates you? You know why you didn't get the job?" I said, "No. Why?" Because your characters grow. Your characters have emotions. Your characters change. Your characters have ambiguity. He doesn't want any of that in his books. He just wants to shoot a lot of people and have a lot of set pieces and technology. He doesn't want any emotion. He doesn't want any growth. He doesn't want his characters to age. People forget, Nancy. The ultimate ageless character, James Bond, right? Never changes. Not true. In the books, from Casino Royale, which was the first book Fleming wrote, to The Man with the Golden Gun, which was the last book Fleming wrote, Bond is an entirely different person. A cold-blooded, brutal, extremely proficient assassin in Casino Royale, and a mumbling, bumbling, stumbling, over-the-hill relic in Man with the Golden Gun, which was going to be the last book he wrote, even if he hadn't died, because there was nowhere else to take Bond, because he had so deconstructed him. So if you read the Bond books in order, you are going to, just like the George Smiley books, just like the Dave Roby Show books from James Lee Burke, you're going to see a character who evolves, changes, and ultimately falls apart. That's a big risk for an author to do. There's a scene. Now, his job in Man with a Golden Gun is to kill a crime guy, an assassin named Scaramanga, the book was much better than the bad film. But early on, when he meets Scaramanga, he has a chance to do it, but he doesn't. In Casino Royale, he would have shot him in the back of the head and moved on to his next assignment, but not in Man with the Golden Gun. So I prefer the Bond example to the nameless big-time author example. I want my characters to age in real time, at least close to it. I want them to have the illusion of reality, because here's why. Getting into the weeds a little bit for writers maybe than readers, but the more depth you have, the deeper you probe beneath the surface, the more you challenge yourself as a writer, the more you reach for more, and the more you're never satisfied with just introducing someone. They have to bring something. They have to bring their own mishigas, their own mess to the story and how they resolve it. So that makes the writing fun for me, more fun for me. And I think it will make the reading more fun for anyone who picks up a Caitlin Strong book.
Well, one of your other series that I read, and I apologize because I'm blanking on the name of the series right now, but the lead characters are Ben and Danielle.
Ben Kamal and Danielle Barnea, the Palestinian-Israeli series.
Yes, thank you. So could you tell everybody a little bit about that series?
Yeah, I think every writer has one great idea, that $1 million idea. Maybe I'm lucky. I've done so many books. I've had one or two. I've had probably two or three, but I wanted to do something no one had ever done before. and I read the book Gorky Park, which became a huge bestseller because it took us into Moscow for the first time. No book had ever introduced us to how the Politburo and the GRU and the KGB, the politics of Russia, Soviet Union in this case. And I thought, wow, I wish I could write a book like that. Well, it was around the time the Oslo Accords were signed. Peace looked like it was really going to happen between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So I said, what about a series that teams a Palestinian detective, in this case, a Palestinian American detective, with an Israeli detective? No one had ever done it before. It was a totally original idea. Just like years later, a female Texas Ranger was pretty much the same thing. I got lucky. So Ben and Danielle's relationship becomes the fulcrum around which everything else spins. What I didn't do in that series was I only had one recurring character, maybe two. But only one of them was really interesting. The head of Palestinian intelligence, Nabil El-Azi, who's like a Louis character from Casablanca. Colorfully corrupt is the way I would describe him. I even pay homage to Casablanca in a scene where he's gambling at the very real life casino in Jericho, which is ironic because it was built by Palestinians, it was owned by Palestinians, but Palestinians couldn't go there because Muslims aren't allowed to gamble or drink. So it was frequented exclusively by Israelis, driving into the West Bank when you still could and going to this beautiful casino in Jericho. There were no casinos in Israel in those days. The only casino there was in the Middle East was in Palestine, the West Bank. So, I have a scene where he's gambling when he's not supposed to be, but the way I do it is it's a homage to Casablanca. So I think that series was very relevant. It was a politically relevant series, which was a departure for me because it was the only time I ever did something I would call politically relevant, something that reached for a little more. But in that sense, it becomes a period piece because peace never happened and it's gotten so much worse. It would be very difficult to write one of those books today because no one would believe it was credible. Because the Israelis and Palestinians, when I wrote that series, for the most part, were working together closely many times. In fact, Yasser Arafat didn't trust his own people. Little known fact that the Israeli Mossad, when Arafat went overseas for many years, it was the Mossad who was protecting him from his own people, because it was in Israel's best interest that he lived. So there was a lot of richness and texture. And I felt like I was opening a door to a world people hadn't seen before. So I'm very, very, very proud of that series. And I get asked all the time, why don't you bring Ben and Danielle back? But it's not so easy. Maybe someday, though, because I brought my first series character, Blaine Mccracken. I wrote 9 books with Blaine Mccracken, and things just wore out in the 90s. But then I brought him back for 2 more books. And staying true to course, I had always introduced him as a Vietnam era Green Beret, the Phoenix Project. So I had to age him. So in the 2 books I brought him back in, Pandora's Temple and the 10th Circle, he's a 61-year-old action hero, which was a little against the norm. But it was important for me to not be disingenuous with the reader. They know how old McCracken is. I can't keep him at 45. It's just not going to work. So, of course, if I wrote him again today, he'd be almost 70. But I'd probably make him 65.
Well, one of the things, I read a lot of romance, and it's very difficult sometimes to set it up so you take 2 characters who look like they should not get along well.
Yeah.
And that's not only Ben and Danielle, that's Caitlin and Court Wesley.
That's right.
And make it work. Were there any particular considerations for you as you kind of shaped those relationships?
Again, let me cop out first before I answer the question.
Okay.
They determined the course of their relationship. I just followed it and chronicled it. But it was their decision because they were so real to me right from the start. But they had a chemistry right from the start. There was a kind of mutual respect for each other. And I think that was an important thing. I think an even better example, if people who read Strong as Steel, the relationship between Dylan, as we discussed earlier, Court Wesley's son and Caitlin Surrogate's son, and Nola Delgado, they're about the same age. And the sexual tension between them, even though anyone reading it knows she's using him, you're figuring it out pretty quickly that something's going on and she's playing him. She's manipulating him in ways only beautiful women can. The challenge, let me divert a little. Romance is something in real life I'm not all that good at, but I'm really good at friendship. So I start every relationship that's important to me as a friendship, where you have the rugged individualist. And by the way, this is the American tradition. Leslie Fiedler, and I'm not going to compare myself to these authors, but I will quote Leslie Fiedler, who wrote, to me, the greatest work of literary criticism of the 20th century, Love and Death in the American Novel, in which he postulates that the greatest relationships in American literature are always between two men. Phineas and Jean in A Separate Piece, Huck and Jim in Huckleberry Finn, Natty Bumppo and Chingachgook in Last of the Mohican series, Ishmael and Queequeg in Moby Dick. The list goes on. And it was the rugged frontier. It was the individual spirit of the American, of the typical American hero, that led to this bonding thing. And I think I'm a creature of that. And not just me, by the way. When you think of Spencer, you think of Hawk. When you think of C.J. Box's great Joe Pickett series, you think of Nate Romanowski. When you think of James Lee Burke's Dave Roby show, you think of Clete Purcell. The strongest relationships are friendship. So my rule of thumb, Nancy, I've never actually been asked this question before or answered anything exactly this way. My rule of thumb is that even if I'm dealing with a man and a woman, it has to start as a friendship. And that describes what happened with Court Wesley and Caitlin. And the other thing is, the one time I divert from that where it's not a friendship is Dylan and Nola Delgado in Strong as Steel. That was romantic tension. That was seduction. That was plays on words, and the way she dresses, the way, little things, like she leaves the house wearing his jeans, things that, boys who are 22 years old, they're basically like walking hormones. So it's a different kind. It was, I won't call it a learning experience, but I had a blast doing it because it was against my norm. It was against the way. See, the other thing is, when I define my villains, and this is interesting, I'd have to look back at this. I think one of the things my villains have in common is, and this is weird because I've never really verbalized it or personified it. My male villains seem to be almost asexual. They seem to define themselves by the love of power and money and pursuit of something more. How much do you want? I want it all. But they tend to objectify women. They tend to devalue women. Because they can't, and it's not so much that they're misogynist, it's that they can't love anyone but themselves. They're incapable of it. And their love for themselves and being unable to legitimately care for another human being manifests itself in the case that they are not fully rounded people. They present this contrast with Caitlin, who is doing everything for other people, whereas the people that she takes on are doing nothing for other people. And I think the point is this. People ask me, Is there a message to my books? Is there a point to my books? Well, Jack Warner used to say when he founded Warner Brothers, that if you want to send a message, use Western Union. Don't clutter up the story with a message, a theme. But yes, you can't help. What I'm talking about comes out in the books, and it is a theme. It's because it shows you how I feel, my value, how I judge a person who does not value other people's lives, only thinks of himself or herself, if it's a female villain, who's never, the next good thing they do for somebody else will be the first. So I think when I define the relationships in my books, friendship trumps romance, which is probably why I could never write a romance, because the evolution of it would be different. It's probably the one form of writing I couldn't do, or cozy mysteries, but we can get to that later.
Well, let's talk about Nola for a second, because you set up a kind of an interesting dynamic where she sort of sees herself as Caitlin's dark mirror image. Did that also just happen spontaneously?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I conceived Nola, it was a vague notion, and here was the original conception of Nola. Nola wasn't going to be a deadly assassin at the age of 24, who is the daughter that her father had with Mexican's most infamous crime boss, known as the Red Widow. My original incarnation of Nola was she was a troubled young woman, and Caitlin finds out, oh my God, I've got a half sister who's a loser. She's on drugs. She's been in prison or jail. She's just not. And I thought this would be a great character moment. As I was talking about before, how do you bring your characters to life? Show them interacting with other characters, and you introduce new characters. As soon as I started the book, that wasn't organic to the story. I needed a killer in this book, a mystery killer. And the character I thought was this loser, druggy, ne'er-do-well, the polar opposite of Caitlin, became the polar opposite of Caitlin in another way, which was much more interesting. Maybe not as challenging to write, but much more fun and much more interesting to write. So when I made the realization in the course of the writing of that she was the assassin who was killing people, that you don't know it's her until very late in the book. Spoiler alert, too late. Too late to use the mute button. When I first conceived her, I had a vague notion that she would be a foil character who would bring out parts of Caitlin. And I think some of their scenes, I think I mentioned chapter 41 of Strong Vengeance. I don't know what the chapter number is, but there is a wonderful scene in Strong as Steel where they go to the ladies' room together. And first off, it's a great scene because Caitlin has never been to the ladies' room with another woman. And that's something you see all the time. You're at dinner, two women get up, I'll go with you. Men don't do that, all right? We don't do that. But women do, go to the ladies' room. So Caitlin said, at one point says, I've never done this before. And they have Caitlin is starting to realize the truth. She's starting to figure it out, but she's not willing to admit it yet. And they have this wonderfully tense exchange, because here's the thing, Nancy. All books, but especially thrillers, are defined by conflict. Every scene is defined by two characters placed in opposition to each other who are trying to resolve something. Information, physical fight, a problem, whatever. But that conflict does not have to be physical conflict. And if I've grown as a writer, it's in my ability to structure scenes that are incredibly tense, incredibly suspenseful, and incredibly fast-paced, where nothing happens except people talking to each other. I don't know how I think it's just growth. Do something long enough and you'll get better at it if you love it. And that's the thing I love about the track my career has held. What do I hate about the track my career has held? I've never reached the sales level that I've always dreamed of. I'm not Lee Child. I'm not even close. Not everybody, nobody, very few people are, but I'm not. But that's the bad. The good is I'm an entirely different writer in so many respects than I was when I started. I couldn't have written a scene like that bathroom scene between Caitlin and Nola in 1983. I probably couldn't have written it in 1995. I don't know if I could have written it in 2017, but that doesn't matter because I wrote it in 2018 or 19. So I have to write my books, as I said, as if each one is the first one you ever read. So each one has to be as fresh and original as the first. Because if the 10th book of the series is bad, and let's face it, a lot of writers, their 10th books aren't nearly as good as their first ones. That's why I love writers like Michael Connelly and Stephen King. They're at it every day and they're getting better. Especially Michael Connelly, Harry Bosch, the Lincoln Lawyer. So I think the ability to grow. I wish my sales would grow more, but in the meantime, I'm going to keep growing as a writer in the hope one will lead to the other.
Well, let's switch gears for a minute here, because there's a thread that runs through every Caitlin Strong book.
Ooh.
And that is the subplot, the parallel story.
Oh, yeah.
With her father and her grandfather.
Or great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. And history. And I'd like to know, how did you come up with the idea of doing these parallel stories, which always dovetail in the end? And there often seems to be a social justice thread in those stories. Is that deliberate, or does it just evolve that way?
Well, it's interesting because the definition of heroism is standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. So social justice plays a huge role because what I'm capturing is frontier justice of the Texas Rangers, and showing by having subplots set as long ago as the mid 1800s, and then flashing forward in back to the present, is that the Texas Rangers, times have changed, but the Texas Rangers are still doing the same thing. They're still fighting the same fights. It's just the names have changed. The weapons have changed. The mission has not changed. Circumstances have. So in a book like Strong from the Heart, the subplot deals with kidnapped children on the Texas, but what it really deals with is I asked myself when I started Strong from the Heart, and this will go to your answer. This will answer your question. I was doing a book in the present about the opioid crisis. I was doing a book which fleshed out the real villains, the government. More spoiler alerts. Mute button. Oops. So I asked myself, okay, what am I going to do in the subplot? What's the flashback thread going to do? What am I going to do this time? Well, I asked myself a question. Everyone talks about the Mexican cartels. Everyone talks about the huge drug problem we have coming over the border with Mexico. Everyone talks about Juarez and the violence down there. And the fact that basically the drug lords run the country. Like Garza, the guy who was in the prison in New York, who escaped twice from prisons in Mexico. So I asked myself, how did it start? How did all this drug dealing, drug business, drugs, how did they come to define Mexico? And I found out in my research very quickly that It was the Chinese immigration. The Chinese came to Mexico in the 1860s, 70s, same time they came to America. In America, they worked on the railroads. In Mexico, a lot of them brought poppy seeds with them. China was the capital of opium. They grew opium. They grew heroin in this beautiful, in Mexico, the land was perfect for growing poppies, for growing narcotics. And there became these bosses that divided up the country. And they had Felipe Yang, and they would have they would take English sounding or Spanish sounding first names, but they would keep a Chinese sounding last name. So I chose one of the first drug lords of Mexico as the villain of this past subplot, and basically credited these Chinese criminals with starting the cartels, because they did divide the country up into different regions, just like the cartels do. So learning that in the subplot of Strong from the Heart, the latest one, piggybacks and dovetails perfectly over the opioid crisis, because we only have an opioid crisis. It's too simplistic to say we only have an opioid crisis, but the opioid crisis we're facing today has its roots in poppy growing by Chinese immigrants in Mexico in the 1870s. So I looked for a connection. Another example, this is probably the best one of all. In Strong to the Bone, I was doing a story about neo-Nazis. So I thought, how about a subplot, a flashback thread about real Nazis in Texas? So I Googled. This is going to sound like I'm making it up, but I'm not. Nazis in Texas. That's what I Googled. And I get all these hits about prisoners of war kept in prisoner of war camps in Texas. I didn't know it. 123,000 German POWs from 1943 to the end of the war were in Texas in 18 different camps. I didn't know that. I said, oh my God. And what I also do in these kind of flashback threads is I try to find a character from real life, a real person to insert. So in Strong from the Heart, the book I mentioned before earlier, Caitlin's great-grandfather, William Ray Strong, joins forces with, I'm drawing a mental block, not Viva Zapata, the guy who was behind the Mexican Revolution. Who was that?
Villa?
Pancho Villa. I'm sorry, just drew a mental. So imagine Pancho Villa as a teenager in this book, as a boy just discovering himself. And I used his real past to set it up. In Strong from the Bone, Caitlin's grandfather, Earl Strong, mixes it up with none other than J. Edgar Hoover. And look, you see me beaming at this. Well, that's a book I wrote 3 or 4 years ago, but it still excites me to talk about it because I love what I do. And I have so much fun writing these books. And because I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't outline. I literally don't know how I'm going to end the book when I start. I don't know how I'm going to get from point A to point. I know I'm going to get from point A to point B, but I don't know about C, D, E, F, G, H. I let the characters guide me. So if I don't know what's going to happen next, how can you as the reader know what's going to happen next? And you know how you love, like you keep turning the pages, what's going to happen? Oh my God, cliffhanger. No, I got to wait 2 more chapters to get back to see what happens. Well, when I'm doing those cliffhangers, I'm having the same feeling you have when you're reading them. I'm keeping my own attention, just like I'm keeping myself writing the pages, like I'm trying to keep you turning the pages.
Well, let's switch gears for a second and talk about something completely unrelated to Caitlin and your various fiction series. You've also written nonfiction.
I have, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, I started my career, this is like Back to the Future. I started my career in journalism. And what I found very early on in my writing, this is when I was at Brown, when I was discovering that I love seeing my name in print and writing. I discovered I was a really good interviewer. I kind of fancied myself a poor man's Studs Terkel, the greatest nonfiction interviewer of all time, in my opinion. And I could tell you Studs Terkel stories for forever. And I was in college, published my first article in People magazine on a sex therapist minister at Brown University, where I was at the time. They had a section called Spirit. I don't want to, it's a too long-winded a story to tell, but circumstances led me to do some celebrity profiles for the Saturday Evening Post. I interviewed Robert Wagner, one of the last interviews ever with the late Natalie Wood. I interviewed the great Gene Kelly. And I love the process of, as you can see, I love talking. And interviews are nothing more than talking. It's conversation. So when the opportunity came to move into nonfiction, and by the way, if I was Lee Child, I wouldn't have gone into nonfiction. But when you're not as successful monetarily or sales-wise as you want to be doing one thing, you diversify. My first agent, who was with me for 20 years, the late great Tony Mendez, once said the most profound piece of advice that I've ever been given. If you know the characters, you can write anything. So what I did was, I looked at books like In Cold Blood, which Truman Capote called a nonfiction novel. I looked at the work of the great Tommy Thompson, and these were real stories that felt like fiction because they were written like novels. So I thought I could transfer the fictional techniques I was using into nonfiction memoir, which is essentially where I started. And I don't enjoy nonfiction nearly as much because I have to stick to what happened. I can't make it up. That's a problem for me. But what I do love about nonfiction is the interview process. I love if I'm doing a book, I've done 3 books now, 2 still are pending. They'll be out in January and May, where basically it's a collection of profiles of people who fit a certain theme. In the May book, lung cancer. In the January book, overcoming adversity and the power of our common humanity. So you have these, each one is a story. It's a story of someone's life. And I'll never forget the story. I mentioned Studs Terkel. And when you're interviewing someone and you're interviewing a lung cancer patient who's been through hell and they're still alive after 10 years. And you don't know how much longer they're going to be alive. And you might be the last person to write about them. You have a massive responsibility. And I remember what I learned from Studs Terkel. I remember this interview he did. I think it was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. That's how long ago it was. He was researching and interviewing for his book, American Dreams Lost and Found. And one of the people profiled was a World War II veteran, someone I think he may have met when he did the book, The Good War, which was I think American Dreams Lost and Found was his greatest book, but many people will say The Good War was. And he had an old reel-to-reel tape recorder and he put it in the kitchen table. And for 4 hours, he talked to this World War II veteran who was about 75 years old then. And well, it comes to 11 o'clock at night. It's time for him to leave. He's going to catch a plane. So he gets up, he packs up, he starts, says, I'm going to go now. I want to thank you very much. And turns off the tape recorder. And the old man reaches up and grabs his arm. The old man was in a wheelchair. And tears are brimming in his eyes. And it says, I'm giving you my life and I'm not finished yet. And Studs Terkel sat back down and spent the entire changed his flight and spent the rest of the night just talking to this old man because he wasn't finished yet. So just like I value my fictional characters, I find their voice. I make them sound real. When I'm writing real people, I find their voice and I make them sound fictional. The challenge is the cliffhangers. Sometimes, especially, if you're doing profiles, everyone is self-contained. But when I write a narrative memoir, a story like Bob Fitzpatrick, the FBI agent, who was destroyed because he tried to stop Whitey Bulger, or Chasing the Dragon, which is a book I co-wrote with one of the foremost DEA agents in history. The narrative is very, very, it's a consistent narrative, and I'm able to use more of what I do well in fiction. But I like fiction better, but there are some parts of nonfiction I really enjoy.
Well, that's actually a nice segue to talk about the tie-in fiction that you're writing. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that and what you have coming out for that?
Yeah, I have I'm so excited about this. And there's a reason for that. My first book in the Margaret Truman's Capital Crime series, Murder on the Metro, will be out in February. And taking over a legacy series like that is such an honor and such a challenge, because you're inheriting something instead of creating it. I had also done 6 books in the Murder, She Wrote series. And my agent called me about 4 years ago now, maybe right around 3.5 years ago, something like that. And on a Sunday, when you get a call from your agent on a Sunday, it's kind of like the old thing, nothing good ever happens after midnight. Nothing good ever happens on Sundays with your agent. Something bad happened, right? And he calls me up and he says, my client, Don Bain, isn't well. He's not going to be able to continue writing the Murder, She Wrote books, based on the fabulously successful TV series that I love. Would you be interested in taking over? In my mind, I think, a shadow of an instant, I've never written a mystery. I've never written first person. I've never written from the viewpoint of an older woman. So my answer was absolutely, count me in. Because in this business, Nancy, the answer is yes. What was the question? You never know when your next opportunity is going to come. So you never turn one down. If it's possible to do, if somebody asked me to write a phone book, I'd probably try to do it, but it would have a great story. So I accepted that job, having absolutely no idea if I was capable of doing it. But I remembered what my agent told me. If you know the characters, you can write anything. So Don Bain and his grandson had written a partial of their original manuscript. But I was troubled by the lack of, I grew up on Agatha Christie. I grew up on her formula for writing a mystery, and she was the best ever. The most successful author in history, by the way, in many ways. I mean, by many benchmarks, there is no one who has done what she's done. She's still selling 100 million books a year. Think about that. It's unbelievable. But Agatha Christie, I wanted to make Murder, She Wrote, because Murder, She Wrote was based on Miss Marple. That's where the idea came from. But the Miss Marple movies, which were black and white, and the Miss Marple books didn't resemble the Murder, She Wrote books at all. So I lifted them up to another level. I took them back to the spirit of the series, TV series, as if it had been written today. And I actually had fun doing it. It was a challenge, but I think but a number of the books I wrote, the last 2, A Time for Murder, in which we meet Jessica for the first time as a young woman. Never before in anything to do with Murder, She Wrote had we ever met young Jessica until A Time for Murder. And then I did what I think is the greatest Murder, She Wrote mystery in history, the written books, because, actually based a little bit on my favorite episode from the series. I wrote a book called The Murder of 12, which is the Murder, She Wrote version of the classic Christie mystery, And Then There Were None. And the response to it, off the charts. I mean, no Murder, She Wrote book has ever gotten the response The Murder of 12 has. And then the follow-up Murder in Season, I think I finally figured out what I was doing. It won a big award, the American Fiction Award for cozies. First time in all the years it has been written, all those books, all those years, never an award until now. And then Berkeley fired me. They dumped me. And they dumped me, I don't know why, because they never exactly explained it. They wanted to go in a different direction. But there was a lot of pushback, especially early on, from longtime readers who didn't like the direction I was taking the series. But an author, that's the same experience I had, remember, when I couldn't work with that big name author who hated me. Because I cannot as much of a whore as I may appear to be, and when it comes to doing anything, writing anything I can, if I see an opportunity, to make a living, because let's face it, I have a mortgage to pay like everybody else. As much as I consider I admit that, yeah, I am profit motive. I'm writing for money. Who doesn't write for money? I mean, I love it, but doesn't mean there's not an ulterior motive. Well, I can't dumb myself down. I couldn't write, and this will give away that it's not this guy. I couldn't write with James Patterson. As much as I respect him, his son is my younger fraternity brother at Brown University, just graduated. Jack, terrific kid. Really so smart. And Jim is a good guy too. Met him a couple times through our Thrill Writers convention. But he gives you an outline. You got to stick to what he wants. I can't do that. You couldn't hand me a Murder, She Wrote book and say, just do what Don Bain did. Because Don Bain wasn't doing it well enough for me. I could do it better. I have to have ownership. And what I love about, as scathing as the earlier response was to my take on Murder, She Wrote, that's how positive the response has been to my taking over Capital Crimes. Because in Capital Crimes, I also took over for Don Bain, but the series is much more friendly to my style. It's third person. It's a thriller. It's action oriented. But what I did with that series too, Nancy, was I went back to its roots. I went back to the feeling of the books that Margaret Truman herself enjoyed the most, that she considered to be the best. And that's the tone I wanted to capture. I didn't want to pick up with the tone that I had been given. I wanted to pick up with the tone that was really Margaret Truman.
Now, when is the next book in that Capital Murder series coming out?
February 16th, Murder on the Metro. The following February, we will see Murder at the CDC, which I'll be finishing this week, first draft. I'm a little bit ahead, but that's a good thing.
Well, we're coming up on time. So would you like to tell everybody where they can find you and what they should look for next?
Well, they should, if, you can find me at, my website is johnlandbooks.com, JONLAND books.com, but I don't do a good job of keeping up with it, updating it. So I tell people to follow me on Twitter at John D. Land, JONDLAND. I'm on Facebook. Message me, drop me a line on my Facebook, on Facebook Messenger, or better yet, Twitter direct message. Or my website. Tell me what you thought of my books. Tell me what you think I should be doing, what you didn't like. I get a lot of negative mail. I return everything. Sometimes it takes me a while. I also think, just here, if you want to know what kind of writer I am and if you should buy my books, forget everything else and do this. Go into a bookstore or go online where you can download a sample. I think you can get the first 40 pages on Google and some about the same on Amazon, and just open to a random page digitally. Just, page through and stop and read that one page, Nancy. If that one page grabs you, if it makes you want to know what happened before and what's going to happen next, buy the book. If it doesn't grab you, don't buy the book. Simple as that. Because my goal, and if we had more time, I'd say, let's try this. Let's try it in Strong from the Heart. Let's see if I practice what I preach. Pick a number, but you can do it at home. And I think this is true of any writer. If you really want to know if you should buy a book, don't go by the flap copy alone. Don't go by the title, the jacket, the description, the reviews, the blurbs. Open it and just read a page. Because if that writer is a great storyteller and they know how to tell a great story, every page is a story in itself. Every page has a sense of incident, a sense of narrative, a sense of character, a sense of conflict, a sense of something that has already occurred and something else that is about to. Homer coined perhaps the two greatest words, or three. The translation is three, the original was two. When he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, he coined the phrase, a medias res, in the midst. Don't start at the beginning. Start in the middle, and then go back and tell us how we got there. That's why the land test, that one page. Go on Google randomly, or find a book available for free, or go into a library and just fool around with that. Pick 5 authors, 5 books, read a page of each. And based on the page you read, buy the book that you like the most, buy the book or take it out of your library, because you're going to love that book if you love that page.
Well, that's a great place to stop. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's been great to have
We
you.
have to stop. We're having so much fun. All right, we'll stop.
Unfortunately, we do eventually have to.
All right, geez. I'm just getting warmed up.
But really, thank you for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for viewing this interview. And you can find John at all the places he mentioned and check out his books. And thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thank you. This was great. I said some things I've never said before, which is hard because I talk so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone. Good night.